She was not awake yet, not completely. The drugs they had forced into her system were still clouding her mind, blurring the line between thoughts and dreams. They invaded her mind and left it spinning, with echoes and afterimages of things buried deep within her consciousness. Blinding lights burned through her eyelids at regular intervals, tinting the world a bright red inside her head. She tried to turn her head, rolling it to the side, but her muscles were like water, and something kept her head from moving. Silent tears formed in the corners of her eyes, partly from the lights and partly because she was slowly winning the battle against the drugs. She was becoming more aware of her surroundings and circumstance. Reality was not what she wanted to wake up to. She clenched and unclenched her fists, trying to get some feeling back into her sedated limbs. Her wrists were fastened to whatever she was laying on, and now she could feel that her head was restrained in a similar way. It was not a comfortable experience, and the stretcher or whatever it was had been moving for quite some time now, if the lights above were any indication. She was wearing an unfamiliar set of clothing as well, the fabric rough against her skin, the collar chafing against her neck as the stretcher rocked back and forth. Her breathing grew labored, and she realized with drug-dampened clarity that she was panicking. It was a surreal feeling, knowing that her body was reacting to her fear of confinement, feeling the panic bloom through her entire being, and yet observing it coldly from the outside, detached from the turmoil but fully aware of it, standing in the eye of the storm. The stretcher jerked sideways and moved her in a new direction. The movements made her realize that it was connected to some kind of tracks, like a railway. The lights grew dimmer on the new path, and finally she dared to open her eyes. The sight of a roof just a few feet above her head did nothing to comfort her. When she looked around as much as her restraints allowed, she realized that the path she was traveling had been constructed for people like her, traveling the way she was traveling. She could make out the walls on either side of the stretcher, too close for her liking. She was thankful for the drugs in her veins then, grateful for not having to face the enclosed space with an unclouded mind. She had never liked feeling constrained, had always hated the subway and other crowded places. She had grown up in a place of open spaces, of farmlands and green fields. Her mother had called her Running Riley when she was little, and she had loved to roam the grasslands around their farm when she was a kid. The running had gotten her a place in the high school track and field team, and might have been enough to get her a scholarship to a minor college if they had not sold the farm and moved to the city. Cardine had not been a big city, but it had been enough to make her feel boxed in, and enough to make her want to run away. School had not gone well after that, and she had gotten into a lot of fights. What had happened after that she did not want to think about, not even with drugs coursing through her system. Unfortunately, someone seemed eager to remind her as a voice echoed through the narrow tunnel, a dry, monotone voice coming from the integrated speakers in the walls.
March 3rd, case number 228509. The State versus Irene Rachel Randall. On the charge of assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty.
The voice recited no indication of feeling in the statement. It was clearly a man speaking, but it was not a voice she recognized.
October 13th, case number 869404. The State versus Irene Rachel Randall. On the charge of armed robbery in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty.
The voice continued. Riley wanted to scream, but her throat was dry and her mouth felt like it was filled with cotton.
January 22nd, case number 523306. The State versus Irene Rachel Randall. On the charge of possession of illegal substances, we find the defendant guilty.
The voice droned on. Riley tried to retreat within her mind, let the drugs numb her senses like she used to before they caught her. But the voice from the speakers nestled their way into her head anyway, no matter how hard she tried. The litany of convictions ended, and for a few seconds she experienced a blissful silence, except for the creaking and scraping the stretcher made as it moved.
March 3rd, case number 228509. The State versus Irene Rachel Randall.
The voice started over, a recording on repeat. A thin sound escaped her dry throat, more a whimper than a scream. The gurney took another sharp turn, and the light grew brighter again. They soon were too bright for her to look at, and she shut her eyes, mumbling to herself to keep the voice out. Birds are meant for the sky. The sky is meant for clouds. Clouds are meant for rain, and rain is meant for us, to hide our tears when we cry. She did not remember where she had first heard the words, but they had stayed with her since her first weeks in the city. She murmured them to herself until her voice gave out, and then she repeated them over and over in her head. The voice from the speakers, reciting her history with the law, was cut off suddenly, and her transport made one last jerky turn, changing tracks with a screeching sound. Somewhere ahead of her, a heavy scraping sound announced a change, and perhaps an end to her cramped journey. The stretcher slowed in its tracks, and almost seemed to hesitate before the square opening that she could barely make out above her head. Suddenly, she was pushed out into a room, and she sucked the air greedily into her lungs, savoring the feeling of open space around her. It was not a huge room by any stretch of the word, but the ceiling was high, about 10 feet or more above her. With a loud click, the bindings that had kept her from moving during the journey through the tight tunnels sprang loose and fell aside. She was about to sit up and look around when the gurney tipped to the side, dropping her into empty space. A brief moment of panic, and then she landed on a hard, cold surface with a thud that punched the air out of her lungs and set her head spinning again. The voice came back then, as she tried to get up on her hands and knees.
Welcome to the Cube, prisoner XE47623. Your behavior in the last few years has been determined to be harmful to society, and therefore you have been placed here, in my care. This place will be your prison until we decide you deserve to be released. The jury in session is a collection of the victims that you have violated through your rampage, the people you hurt, or the relatives left behind in the wake of your destructive behavior. You will either be addressed as prisoner XE47623, or by the name I have given your case file, Bird. This room is but one of many like it, but they will all give you different challenges and have different dangers. You are somewhere inside a huge network of these rooms, these cubes, and it is up to you to find a way out.
Riley listened to the voice, her head still spinning, but the effect of the drugs almost completely gone. Slowly, she got up into a crouching position and looked around. The room was constructed like a cube, the walls decorated in a strange pattern and sectioned with sharp lines, creating a grid of large squares along all flat surfaces, floor, walls, and ceiling alike. The opening she had been dropped from was halfway up towards the ceiling, and she watched the gurney roll back into the wall, the tracks receding with it. The hatch began to slide shut, the scraping echoing in the empty chamber. The voice spoke to her through the speakers again. As she realized the only obvious way out was being taken away from her, she scrambled towards the wall, searching for handholds or cracks in the surface, but finding nothing to help her ascend.
Your time here will be as short or long as we decide, and it will not be easy. You will face all that we throw at you, and receive only the things we choose to give you. This is your punishment. This is your cage. But you can get through it, Bird. There is a way out if you look hard enough. Good luck, prisoner, and remember, there is always a way.
With a definite slam, the hatch closed.